Hi, I'm Rasheed Ogunlaru and I'm delighted to be here with Darryl Bailey, who's author of Dismantling the Fantasy. And I just love the title. Let's just go straight in there. What's Dismantling the Fantasy about?
I'm basically pointing out to people that the experiences that they have in life do not support their usual assumptions of life. So we usually go through life thinking that it has some sort of form to it, that we are able to identify that form, that we understand that form, that we are one of the forms in life, and that we somehow are directing our lives through the world towards certain goals. And I'm simply pointing out that everyone's common experience does not support that in any way whatsoever. Instead, it actually points to something much more radically opposite.
So that is very radical, isn't it? Because you look around and you think, well, hang on a minute, this seems to be form, this seems to be form. I seem to be looking at somebody else. I seem to have people in my life,
Yes.
and that's people's experience, and I seem to have things to do. And you're saying actually that's not quite how it is. Do you want to tell us more? And you say that we know that to be our experience too.
Yes, everyone knows that already, that that's not the truth. We acknowledge that all the time. In fact, we go around complaining that everything is changing. So for an infant, there's no actual sense of existence. There's no sense of what it's actually presenting. But as we apparently grow older, all of us will eventually start saying that everything is changing. That's our common experience. It doesn't matter whether it's a thought or a mood or a relationship or a body or a career, the planet, the galaxy, whatever. It's always moving and shifting and changing, so that every one of us knows that everything is changing. We go around complaining about it all the time. My body isn't what it used to be, the government isn't what it used to be, the economic system isn't what it used to be. So we're always registering this fact, but we're never actually registering what that means, because if everything is changing, then that must mean that life itself has no particular form. If everything that we know of is obviously moving on to something else, it's aging and fading away, new things are arising, that must mean that existence has no particular form. And yet we're all attempting to hold certain situations in place, and we're ultimately frustrated by that time and time again. So I'm just pointing out that if you want to acknowledge your experience, you will have to acknowledge that life is basically a formless event, and it's basically doing what it's doing all on its own, because we don't make the changing happen, and we're not able to stop it. So it's always moving and shifting and changing. It's moving on its own. We're actually a presentation of the movement. Everything that we are is a presentation of this movement.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because everything we've been told in our lives is from this idea that in some way, shape or form, that you can get to some point where things will be fixed. In some ways that you've got either a relationship and it's fixed, or that you can achieve a certain amount of things that will bring you happiness or something, and that will in some way, whatever the idea is of that, be fixed.
Yeah.
But you're saying actually people have got this sense that they're struggling to hold on to something that is constantly moving and is elusive.
Exactly. Everyone throughout their life, if they've lived life for a reasonable amount of time, they realize that no matter what they've come to, no matter what they thought they were getting in a particular situation, that somehow has shifted and moved on to something else. And then often, in certain cases, it is obviously moving on to something that we don't want. So it doesn't matter. Again, it could be a thought, it could be a mood, it could be a relationship. We're always wanting to get these thoughts and moods and relationships to a certain point and hold them still, but they don't have any particular form. They're always moving on to something else. So we get those golden glowing moments, the golden insights, the glowing moods, the moment that our relationship seems to be just perfect, and we want to hold it in place, but we can't hold it in place.
And it would seem that there's a tie here with lots of the Buddhist philosophy that everything is suffering. So something about that the human condition, because it's merely that wanting of things to somehow be fixed.
Yes.
that is disappointing. That leads to disappointment.
Exactly. There's a frustration in that, and if the frustration is over something that seems to be incredibly important, then it's an actual suffering. But this isn't related necessarily to Buddhism, because Taoism teaches the same thing, Christianity teaches the same thing. All of the most fundamental traditions that I know of, the great traditions, are all pointing to this one great event. They're all saying that the ground of existence is a totally unformed happening or presence or event, and that this whole notion that we're in charge of it, that we're somehow going to manipulate it to our ultimate benefit, just is not true, and so we're ultimately frustrated.
And it's quite a funny kind of paradox, isn't it? Because somewhere this thing of that I can do this, or even if it's just I can change my hair colour or the clothes, or do certain things, gives us this idea of control, that
Yes.
that I am controlling my life because I've chosen to wear this today, or I've chosen my career. So that it would seem that we're presented with things that give us a sense that there's some things that we control, even though we don't turn to some things that you've been talking about, like the fact that the blood's just pumping around and we've got nothing to do with that.
Right.
So is it purely those little things that we hang on to the fact that it seems that I've chosen my cardigan today that stops us from seeing, from recognizing this? Do you feel?
Well, in some ways. I mean, once again, we all ultimately know that we haven't created our body or our brain. We haven't created our needs, our interests, our concerns. We haven't created our abilities or our lack of abilities in any particular area. So it becomes, I mean, if we simply acknowledge what we already know, then we must at some point realize that we're not actually moving ourselves through existence. And yet, even though if I sit down with somebody and I ask them these questions, like, do you think you create your body and brain? Do you really feel that you've created your needs, your interests, your abilities, or your lack of abilities? They'll say, no, I haven't, but somehow they still retain this notion that they're directing their existence. If you haven't created your interests, how are you creating your direction in life? Because if your interests are given by nature or whatever this big event is, they must be fundamentally channeling your movement through existence, your apparent movement through existence. The really curious thing about this is that even though absolutely everyone can acknowledge this, it's a very simple thing to acknowledge, it only seems to be important to a few people.
And that's what's it would seem fascinating. It would seem on the one hand that the frustration and that you describe is very commonplace. You know,
Yes.
why is this happening? A lot of people, but it would seem that not that many people are wanting to look more deeply than very superficial things of why I'm not feeling happy or content in myself.
Yes.
But it would seem from what I've had, the bit I've had about your own experience in your own life, that you were looking to understand about life. You looked into, you became a monk, you followed. But do you think that there was something in you that you just found yourself asking questions? Can you tell us a little bit about how this happened for you? How this realization of seeing that actually, hang on a minute,
Sure.
happened?
I mean, I have no ultimate reason for it. It just seems that that's the way this event has expressed me. It expresses everyone in a slightly different fashion. So in my own apparent situation, from a very early age, I had the sense that life was somehow one great event. And so I would have very radical experiences of all the thoughts falling away and simply this sense that everything was one event. It was somehow animated, it was moving and shifting on its own, and that somehow I wasn't separate from it. But the moment that would present itself, it would then kind of flip back to a sense that I was somebody very much separate from existence and someone who was somehow needing to figure out what it was all about. And so that seemed to provoke this lifetime search in a way, and I went through many different traditions, exploring. Basically I was interested in what did they offer as far as an open exploration of life, which eventually became just an open exploration of the moment. And in that, along the way, there seemed to be certain insights that would arise. So, you know, in my early 20s, I began to question, like, how do we actually decide to go in a particular direction if we don't create our body or our brain or our interests or our abilities?
Right.
Because that's all that we're functioning on. I mean, if that's given by nature, how are we making the ultimate choice? And then later on, all the way along, it seemed that life was simply this formless event. But somehow there was this sense that I was still separate from it, until one day it just became obvious that I hadn't created any of what I am, and therefore I have to be actually an expression of this, whatever this event is. So it was, I mean, at that point, it simply came by reading a line in a book. The line said, no one has ever actually experienced a sense or experienced a situation where they've decided to move their life in a certain direction. And upon reading that line, it just became absurdly obvious that all of this is just the movement of nature. I mean, you can call it the movement of nature, or the movement of the universe. Ultimately, the universe is a great unformed event. Some people like to call it the Great Spirit, or God. They like to label the Great Spirit God, and so on.
And there's something about this thing about, and I think it came up in the talk that you gave yesterday, this thing about choice and control. These words seem to come up, don't they? Seem to kind of emerge. And it would seem that everything that you've said seems, yeah, actually, no, that's true. I haven't created this body. Yeah, there's stuff going on here that I'm not shaping. I'm finding myself blinking. I haven't done that. The breathing's happening how it is. But then we seem to this discussion about choice, and then it becomes difficult. Have you got a take on what that's about? Because I guess we've been conditioned that we do, because we seem to find ourselves in this kind of body.
Yes.
We seem to feel as though we do have some kind of choice or control, and if it's the case that that's not the case, then it everything that we do and we consume it seems a little bit odd.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that, because I'm sure it comes up a lot in your talks?
Yes. Yeah, that's the real sticking point for most people. They're really worried that if it's the case that they don't have choice, that everything somehow from that moment on is just going to spiral downwards, because they're still feeling that they are ultimately in control and that they've gotten themselves to the place that they are now. And I'm just pointing out that right from the very apparent beginning of what you are, it's never been a matter that you've been influencing it, because everything you are is an expression of nature. So when we were in the womb, we weren't deciding to get bigger. We weren't sitting there with a little chart and a stopwatch saying, I've got to get out of here in 9 months' time. Like, that's just absurd. We were the movement of nature. When we were outside the womb, we didn't decide to grow larger. We didn't decide to start walking. We didn't decide to start thinking. All of this is simply the expression of the flow of nature. And so on through this apparent process, we don't decide what our interests are. We don't decide what our particular abilities are, and we don't give rise to what our lack of abilities are. So when people see this and they start to acknowledge this, they can be struck with an incredible fear, the feeling that somehow, if they should even consider that this be the case, everything's just going to fall apart. And I'm simply pointing out that it's never been the case that you were influencing it in the first place. And the weird thing is, we see this all the time. We already know it. Like, I can say these things to you, and you nod your head because you know it's true. However, even given all of that, there are certain people who will just find that incredibly fascinating, and within their apparent process, the whole sense that they're doing it will fall away, and they will basically realize what all the great spiritual traditions have been saying right from the beginning. So in the Bible, you have the statements that God is spirit, so that's a great formless presence or event, and it is in God that we live and move and have our being. And then along with that, you have Christ saying, if you believe what I say, then the Spirit will present itself in your body. And so in meditation traditions, when you sit down and do absolutely nothing, you discover that the whole process that you are is a matter of breath coming and going, heart beating, vibration, pulsation, a little twinge here, a little twinge there. It actually presents itself as this moving, shifting event. So this is the Spirit, this great unformed event presenting itself. If you go to Taoism, they say everything is the Tao. It's normally translated as the way, but another translation could be the flow or the current of life. If you go to quantum physics, they just state outright there are no things, there is only process, and it's not a situation of cause and effect, that this process is somehow simply presenting itself all on its own. It's not a matter of one thing influencing another, it's just one great event presenting itself.
And what's fascinating about that is for the person in this happening,
yes,
there's seems to be a sense of, once what you've described is noted, aha, that is the case, I never did that, and this stuff just seems to be happening.
right.
there seems still a sense that either that once that's seen, that something's going to be somehow different because I'll somehow be at peace with all of that, or flow with it, or dissolve into it, or what have you, and that those ideas about control will evaporate. So there's an interesting thing that is emerged. So, for example, when I come along to your talks, one of the questions that emerges, and it happens with lots of people who are speaking, doing this kind of work, that one of the questions comes up, okay, so what shall I do? Right. So what's being said is being seen and recognised, and then there's still a sense of, okay, so given that, what shall I do?
Exactly.
Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I'd like to borrow a line from the Zen traditions, which say, I'd really like to offer you something, but I don't have anything to offer you. And basically, I like to say straight out that there's only one thing you can do. What you can do is simply be whatever nature is presenting in this moment. It's never been your efforting that created what you are. You simply are an expression of existence. And whatever you are in this moment is already gone, is already moving on to something else, because there is only this great unformed dance of existence. So, yes, I mean, people are, I know it is odd. Like, I see totally what you're saying. It is a totally inexplicable, unformed event doing what it does, and yet the person then asks, what am I supposed to do in the midst of that? Well, basically you're being done. So all that you can ever do is be whatever nature is presenting in any moment. It's the only thing that can happen. A lot of people look back through their lives and they think, oh, if I'd only done this back then, everything would be much better. But in any particular moment, you can be, whatever you do is the only thing you can be, because it's the movement of existence. It's not your choice to be what you are. You are the expression of some great mysterious event. And in that, you're a unique expression. Because once again, we know that there are no two snowflakes the same, no two leaves the same, no two trees the same, no two people have the same breath rate, the same pulse rate, no two people have the same skin composition. It's radically different for each and every person.
Right. So this idea that, and there seems to be an idea that if, let's say, one's gone down what we would call a spiritual path to try and look at life and and to look, there's an idea that somehow some realization or something will happen in the same way that if I go down a material path of accumulating things, that some happiness thing will happen.
Right.
The just idea is that somehow something will be different. Is that what you said? There's just this idea, and because I mention it because it would seem that lots of people who find themselves will still find themselves looking for a long time, or trying to still find something, but should something have changed? I mean, I've read the book and still feeling somehow.
Yes, and it's so.
So manifestation will still happen, however it's happening. That's what you're saying. But
that's right.
It seems an idea, isn't it? There's some secret spiritual thing that somehow something will shift.
That somehow will, if those who have this realization will somehow all join hands and sing the same song of love and peace, and it just isn't the case. Each and every so-called person is a unique expression of existence, even the so-called awakened ones. And it's the fact that, 100 people can read this book, and maybe a certain percentage will have no interest in it, in what it's saying, even though it's very clear to them what it's saying. Another group of people will read the book and it's very clear to them, but after they've set the book down, and it's very interesting in that moment, but over time, over apparent time, they will kind of just flow on to another interest. Other people will read this book, and somehow it just seems like everything radically shifts. It doesn't matter what is actually going on. In all cases, life will continue to express itself on its own. You will be expressed in any way existence expresses you. Even having the awakening doesn't guarantee that it's going to move in a cerden direction.
And I just want to finish with a question that you've kind of already touched on with what you were saying there, that somebody who might be watching this might think, what you've said is very arresting. There's something very rich, there's something here in what it is that you're saying. But my experience seems to be that my life is painful and lots of things are happening to me, and I've got a very clear sense that I'm here in this particular situation, and there's lots of things that I'm not liking and I can't. Yeah. Is there anything that you would say for somebody who's wanting to, is hearing something that you're saying, and wanting to perhaps investigating further, but that somehow can't tally that with their experience that life is hard and difficult for them and problematic, and everything seems to be very, very fixed.
Right.
But I'm drawn to what it is that you're saying. What, anything that you would share or express?
I mean, basically, if somebody's interested in this, it's a matter of considering the basic fact of what I'm presenting. So, I mean, I've written these books for people who do have some interest in this. But over and above that, I would just like to point out that no matter how difficult somebody's life is, it's also presenting somewhat pleasant situations, so that life is always moving in an up and down fashion. So it's joy and sorrow, clarity and confusion, confidence and anxiety. That's life's movement. Again, if we look into nature, it's always moving in these wave patterns. Waves rise up and fall down in the ocean, the breath rises up, fades away, the heartbeat rises up, clenches and relaxes. It's always this rising up and fading away. It's always moving on to something else. So even in a situation that seems to be really somewhat dire, that will move on to a feeling of pleasure in certain moments. Now, that basic feeling that it's difficult may last a long time, but even that will radically shift at some point and move on to something that would be considered pleasant. So it's just a fact of life. Life goes up and down, and a lot of people want to avoid those situations, but this is ultimately saying, no, that's part of the gift. That's part of the dance of life, and there's no way to get around that.
And what you're saying seems to be very beautiful, because we could just look out at the window now, where it's in autumn, and we can see that happening.
Yes,
so I think
exactly.
what's really interesting about it is actually if we just to look,
Yes.
just take a look at what seems to be going on around you, and you'll probably find that this is what's happening.
Exactly, that's the case, that we get the conceptual perspective presented to us in a fairly clear way, pointing to what our experience actually is. And then it's just a matter of, when we sit down and do absolutely nothing, we happen anyway. We look outside, we see nature moving and shifting all the time, we see the city changing, we see the country changing. It's always moving on to something else. It's our basic fact of existence. Everything that we know of is changing. So it simply becomes a matter of, do you want to acknowledge your actual experience? Because if you do, it becomes very difficult to find any permanent form, and it also becomes impossible to ever actually explain what this is. And at some point, it may or may not become impossible to see yourself as anything apart from that dance.
And there seems something that I was going to close, but you said something there that I thought was very very rich. This thing about there's no way to explain it. It would seem that sometimes the wanting to explain,
Yes.
the wanting to label, the wanting to understand it either as spiritual, as this, as that, because all sorts of things will have all sorts of names,
Yes.
Isn't necessarily helpful or even necessarily illuminating.
No, because basically this is a totally inexplicable event. And I don't know if we have time to go into this, but it's when every one of us knows that when we came out of the womb, we had no explanation for existence. We all know that it took a lot of apparent years to be trained to bark certain sounds. When somebody pointed here, we barked the word nose. When somebody pointed here, we barked the word ear, and we were trained to bark those words. Now somehow, it seems that we believe those sounds are somehow explaining existence. If we
And trained that a combination of those words, of ideas, equals something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we end up with these complex storylines, which are really just collections of meaningless sounds pointing to an event that has no particular form. So it's fine if you're having a meal and you ask somebody to pass the salt, or may I have a glass of water, that's fine. It becomes a totally other thing when you try to explain existence, because these are meaningless sounds attached to forms that don't exist. If we lived in a different country, we'd get a totally different set of sounds. Instead of talking about a body and consciousness and a world, we could, if we wanted to, we could agree to use the words blix and flute and wassail. So if we sit around and we talk about a body and consciousness and a world, that seems to make a lot of sense to us. We feel like we understand existence. But if we were sitting around talking about blix and flute and wassail, it's gibberish. And I'm just pointing out that the words body and consciousness and world are total gibberish too. It's just meaningless sound attached to apparent forms that don't actually exist. It tells us nothing about anything. And so ultimately, it's kind of waking up to the event of life. If we were to go to the Bahamas, we wouldn't sit in the hotel lobby reading a brochure about the sun and the sand and the surf. We would chuck the words and go outside into the living event of that situation. And I'm saying it's exactly the same situation in this so-called spiritual setting, where basically most of us sit around focusing totally on the storyline and ignoring the larger event. Thoughts are this much of this larger event of the moment, just this much, and yet all of the focus goes on that storyline. That storyline is just meaningless sound attached to forms that actually don't exist.
So it's interesting what you're saying is that there's this conceptualization, and that the focus that is always within conceptualization that perhaps fogs from seeing what's actually happening without getting caught back in the labelling of it, and just accepting that labelling will come in and go out, but it is just the label that it happens to be called salts.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Even though we don't actually know that much about what it actually is.
Exactly.
When we then,
Yes, that's it in a nutshell, basically.
Well, it's been a real pleasure. I'm sure with Dismantling the Fantasy, I know that's available on the website, and it's been a real pleasure. And thank you very much for coming to the UK, and thank you very much for taking time out here, Darryl. Pleasure to see you. All the best.
Yeah, same here. It was nice meeting you, and I really enjoyed my time here. So, yeah, I've had a good time all around. England's a great place. London's a great city. So it's nice.
Sure is.
It's nice being had.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
So.